people can, well, I think maybe everyone already did, but if you want, otherwise toss in your names up there. And let's see. Oh, I did these things. Well, not that, but that's okay. So we have two pending proposals. The first one, both of which I think there's someone who's interested. The first one is Aaron proposed no-op method calls. The idea is to basically move, this is already a Clippy lint as I understand it, but maybe generalize the mechanism, but give warnings about these kind of annoying methods, like pulling a reference that just gives you back a reference. And this is often a kind of, or it's sometimes a source of confusion for people because they mean to clone the T, not the ampersand T. And
I also thought this was a Clippy lint, but it turns out there's a little bit more to it than what the Clippy lint does. Very close, though.
yeah, it's a generalization of a Clippy lint, I guess, right?
Yeah.
Oh, I seconded this. That basically, I thought we should just approve the PR, but I wanted to give people a chance if they wouldn't like to see this lint. This is something Clippy classifies as a correctness lint. I think there's I feel like I've seen some bugs, although it seems more like a confusion lint to me, because it often gives type errors.
Well, and it's nice to have a proper compiler lint when it's a type error, because then it can actually lint earlier. As I recall, Clippy can't lint if there's type errors, right?
That's a good point. Yeah, I think that's true. All right. Well, any objections to this going? I mean, the main point here is to give people a chance to speak up before Aaron wastes time making a PR if people are against it as a lint.
I think it's good, but maybe we want it to be allow, at least for like, and maybe making it more and be an addition change. I'm just thinking about the possibility that people actually have a lot of these in their code, maybe without realizing it, and then we're just going to suddenly give everyone a bunch of work to do to get the warning to silence when we turn it on.
Yeah, we could probably evaluate that.
Yeah, like a later kind of thing. But yeah, if that's the case, that was the only thing. Like, then we maybe would want to tie it to the addition, so then people are cargo fixing and then solve the problem immediately.
Yeah, that's another question of how hard is it to write an automated fix?
I mean, it just should be pretty easy, right?
Yeah.
Just removing.
I'm also a big fan of this for. I'm also a big fan of this for another reason. It's another way that you can suddenly discover, oh, oops, I didn't actually realize I had a reference here.
Yeah, I think the lint seems good. Just want to make sure we don't have like a flag day where suddenly everyone has to go through their code.
Right.
Yeah.
I have two quick comments. One, is this lint specifically limited to cases where the function call returns exactly the same type that went into the function?
It's opt-in to the method is the way it was described. So
yeah,
there'd be some rusty attribute or something like that. It's not a generic thing that applies to everything.
Right, but I guess I'm saying, is there some sort of mechanism for making sure that we're not placing this lint in places where just removing the method call isn't actually a correct solution?
I don't think there was a plan to make that automatable. Just
okay.
Don't mess it up. Yeah, you're right that you could mess it up.
And presumably this is only linting when it's actually in method call position and not if you're calling it via UFCS or something.
That's right.
Okay, thanks.
That was, actually, I'm not sure about that point. Probably, but yeah, it says here that
if you call it as clone : clone, I might want this anyway, right?
Yeah, it didn't. I don't know. You could ask a question. I'm not sure about that. That would be something we you have an opinion?
And then my final point that I wanted to make was that I'm not totally sure I buy into the argument about waiting and keeping this at allow to begin with. And I'm curious both what you see is specific about this warning in particular versus other warnings that we introduced without an addition boundary that makes it merit that kind of like more like big flag day approach.
I mean, it's possible that I think what I would want is a crater run, and then if there are a lot of crates that are gonna, like a lot of, it seems common that people would introduce this something see this warning, because the code works, right? That's sort of the issue. Is the code that they're compiling doesn't actually have a bug.
Got it.
And so Lint is mainly just helping them. Someone has probably made a mistake if and then this helps them decipher the type error that they get later, right?
Did we ever develop a sort of, oh, sorry to interrupt. Go ahead.
Well, yeah. So I was just thinking maybe there are a lot of people who have this without realizing it, and then will trigger the lint, and then we don't want that to be like an experience where you update your Rust compiler and you have 20 warnings that you have to go and fix in your code base. That's all.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah. And if that's not the case, then I really don't care. But if you can turn it on, I'm happy to make it allow immediately if it seems like it's not common.
I sort of would like a general policy for like when we introduce warnings at what level and what sort of transition is allowed, but I don't know if we have one yet. So
Yeah,
I think we had basically the same conversation on the referencing things. Maybe that's nominated again today, because apparently there's a lot of people who do like ampersand vec.clear. So we had the same conversation of, oh, how many people are doing this? How much of a pain is it going to be to turn on the warning?
Yeah.
I don't know.
Policy, that's sort of the issue. Yeah.
There's two policies that we have kind of been kicking down the road. I think a little bit of a lint policy and a regression treatment. Like, do we want to revisit our notion of our standards for what kind of things we will change? Probably should talk about them, though they're not the same.
At least the lint policy doesn't lock us in as much. We can always change it again.
Right. All right. Well, any other points on this? Okay, I didn't hear anything that said like don't do it. It sounded to me. So the other point, this was raised by Scott, was pointing out that we have in the macro rules, you can use keywords as identifiers except for special keyword. And proposed, I think, an addition change, Scott, is that right?
I think it would have to be, because it's very clearly breaking otherwise. Josh probably wants to talk to this as well, because he's the one who asked me to write this MCP.
Yeah. Part of the reason this came up in particular was the item we discussed a couple of weeks ago now, I believe, that proposed $self and possibly $super as analogous to $crate, so that you could access items from the same crate, but instead of starting from the top level, you start from the module that contained the macro. And then that led to the point of you can actually use $self as just a generic macro argument name today. There's no prevention of using a keyword. You can't use $crate, that one's prevented, but you can use $self, $super, $if, $for. It seemed like reserving the syntax would be helpful for any future things we may wish to do in terms of, I don't know, I mean, even if we want to add like interesting repetition mechanisms using $for macro conditionals with $if, but whatever we might want to do, having keywords seems confusing and limits our future options. And we have a concrete proposal on the table to use $self and $super.
So I agree that keywords should not be allowed. Like, it seems like a perfectly reasonable addition change to stop allowing keywords for this. However, I am not sure if self and super are actually keywords in the way that we have it set up right now. And so I don't know if that.
Self can't be used as a let name or a function name, at least. The error says it's a keyword.
Okay, good. Because I guess it was capital self that is not a keyword. I think
That sounds right.
Right.
You can, outside of an info block, capital self is not reserved in any way. So yeah, that sounds to me. This sounds like we should do it in addition, but it's a bug fix basically. Like we should reserve these the right to make keywords with $signs.
Yeah, if you do let self equals 4, you get self as a keyword as your error.
Cool.
So I would say if it errors with let, it should error here. Sorry, go ahead, Josh.
No, just lag was causing a crosstalk. The one other thing that we need to be concerned about is how widely used this currently is. Obviously, we have the ability to make this change in an addition, but we don't like to do changes that are incredibly high impact. We can obviously provide a Rust fix for this that just does alpha renaming, but nonetheless, I would generally propose that we do a crater run or some equivalent search of all the crater accessible code base that detects which keywords are widely used, and we could go ahead and directly do in the addition a prevention of using all the keywords that would be low impact. The ones that, if there are any that would be, thousands and thousands of regressions, we may want to consider a phase in using a addition forward compatibility lint.
I think
I would have expected a forwards compatibility, or I'm not sure what you meant by that, but I would have expected the addition to lint in the older edition and then provide an automated migration, probably using rhash. I don't know, but I think this Wally wants an RFC, doesn't it?
Yeah, rhash works. I've tested it.
Yeah, I think the only thing is I think that the most likely culprit for a common use is going to be self, because people passing in their method receiver into a macro will probably, I'm pretty sure I've definitely created a macro variable named self.
Yeah, there are cases of this.
Self has come up on the Zulip thread already of a bunch of people saying, I like using self.
Yeah.
Yeah, it looks like searching.
We just need a convention. I think what would be interesting with that case would be maybe instead of in general, we should just switch to rhash. If someone has if rhash if, maybe for self we create a new convention. We suggest using this for that case, and then Rust fix them to this.
If it's
rhash self,
then we'd have to make sure it's not in use, but sure.
Maybe
Yeah,
this is too big a deviation from the existing plan, but it does seem like there's an actual ambiguity here being suggested by the syntactic ambiguity, which is that when you see $ something in a macro, it's not clear whether it's the start of a sort of semi-hygienic path or whether it's starting to refer to a variable name. And maybe that's an indication that we should actually be coming up with a different syntax to refer to the two rather than just plugging in more keywords.
That is
Yeah.
fair.
No.
If we wanted a different syntax for meta syntax within macros rather than variables, among many other things, almost anything starting with $1 is not allowed. So $, or any number of other things would allow us to have a standardized syntax. That said, we already have $crate here, and consistency would suggest that we would then want $self, $super, but we could always introduce $crate and $self and $super, and then just say $crate is a historical artifact.
Right. I'd imagine
Right.
any new syntax we introduce, we'd also suggest that people use for what is today $crate.
Right.
I'd like to move us on, but I feel like this is enough discussion that I don't know, that I'm not totally sure about the I guess the FCP to pursue this seems okay, but there's definitely like a need for an RFC or some kind of discussion around it. That's my impression. We should discuss how to move it forward.
It may make sense rather than having this proposal narrowly be we should reserve keywords. We may instead want to charter it to be we should introduce a forward compatible way for us to allow additional syntax in macros that we can make use of without any conflict with users, whether that's let's reserve keywords or whether that's let's define a namespace like $. Either way, we could say the point of this group is we need the ability to expand macros in the future, and we should have a well-defined reserved syntax for that, whether it's keywords or something else.
Yeah, I agree.
And then we can evaluate on the basis of like what's high impact, what's low impact on the ecosystem.
Yeah, like I think in this meeting we've already come up with 2 possible alternatives. Both seem equally viable to me. So that would be an ideal way to frame it.
Okay. I agree with that. I'm not, if someone like, all right, I'm just not sure if we are going to actually, this is growing from someone's going to whip up a quick RFC to we're going to have a lot of stuff. And I'm getting concerned.
Well, hypothetically, if we did introduce a different introducer syntax, as long as that was something that isn't a conflict with anything that works today, like $$ is not the start of any valid production today, then it doesn't have to be an addition boundary, so it's not a big rush. The only big rush would be if we want to do a breaking change with a proper transition for the addition, like keywords. So I think we should do a quick crater evaluation of the possibility of reserving keywords, see how big an impact it would be, possibly reserve some or all or none of them with a transition, and then decide what we want our syntax usage to be for things like self and super.
Okay. If someone wants to open a PR or like try to find someone to open a PR, that would be fine. But let's move from this onward, I guess. This is our kind of rough consensus, right? I want to make sure we actually have time to do some of the other things. I wanted to call attention to the meeting proposals. I don't think we have no design meeting scheduled this week. This is scheduled for next week. People are supposed to read the paper. And there was a proposal filed to discuss fair trade objects in the 2021 edition. 2 weeks ago, I guess. I don't know if we want to use a meeting to talk about it. I kind of think it might make sense to do a meeting time to talk about the 2021 edition in a larger sense.
I think if Varkor could be prepared for that conversation by tomorrow, then having at least the start of that conversation tomorrow seems like a good idea.
I'd be inclined to do it, not tomorrow, but like 2 weeks from now. But, just because tomorrow seems last minute. I don't know if the other point is that there's also backlogging. I guess I went through you all may have seen, I went through the backlog bonanza and assigned a bunch of things to people, but not all of them. Is this something we need a meeting for?
Possibly, possibly not. The major thing is kind of a question of taste of like, we have warned about this for a while, but is this something we're prepared to completely prevent in a new edition? It certainly rubbed some people the wrong way in 2018, but at the same time, it is not. It would be useful for syntax purposes.
Okay.
But yeah, does anybody think we shouldn't do this? If the answer is no, then it may be that we don't need a meeting.
Yeah.
I haven't seen anything that says we should change from the path. It seemed like we were pretty much on this path of next edition, make it into hard error. So
I think we should do it. I think one of the things that we need to do for the edition is to kind of actually soon probably is to look over the idiom lints and kind of schedule them for changing. Like, in other words, we never really turned on the 2018 edition idiom lints by default in 2018 and stuff like that. And there was a plan to start doing that as part of the 2021 edition RFC. And so we probably should review them in general, and this might be a good candidate of one. So like we could maybe talk about it as part of that. I'm gonna write a meeting proposal around that. I think that's an important thing for us to get on top of, and it's been on my mind. To review those, or at least I'll write up a document. Whether we need to meet about it, I don't know. All right. I'm going to skip, because we have a lot of nominated things, I'm going to skip over the project board unless there's any updates from existing projects people want to surface who are in the meeting. Okay. So let's start with this. Mark, you posted a PR. Are you here? You are here.
I am. Yeah. I don't know that we necessarily need to discuss in the meeting. If people, there was no significant change from what we had discussed last time we talked about this.
Okay, I mostly wanted to let people know. So we have this problem. This regression we've been working towards. There's a PR. I have to admit, reading the PR description, I had a hard time understanding exactly what it did, but I'll have to reread it. I was reading fast. But we should probably review it.
I guess one thing to maybe call out is that it does change the behavior. Like it basically says that like the current behavior for forbid in different scopes is unified with the new behavior for forbid in the same scope, which I think we had sort of broad agreement on. But it does mean that we remove a hard error of the different scope forbid if you have cap lints turned on, which is potentially sort of people might care about that, but probably
So basically,
discuss on the PR.
If the forbid occurs, you get a lint. Is that what it is?
Essentially, yeah.
Is it a deny by default lint?
So, well, you don't actually get a lint, you get an error, but you only get an error if the forbid itself would have actually been a forbid. So if you have cap lints, forbid doesn't take effect because it's like lowered by cap lints, if that makes sense.
I see. So if you try to allow a lint that has been forbidden, you get an error, but only if that lint would have been an error.
Essentially, yeah. Well, would have been forbidden. So like if you do cap lints deny, it's still not an error, which is weird potentially, but sort of consistent.
Okay, I see. We get no. Okay. That seems reasonable nonetheless. All right, let's move on then. People can, do we need an FCP to land that?
I think that would be probably consistent since it is changing stable behavior.
So we don't need to make a consensus of the meeting at this moment. So tracking issue, this one, OR patterns. People were asking about stabilizing OR patterns, and I haven't looked at the state of the implementation. In fact, but there are 2 unresolved questions that seem relevant. One of them was whether to support this notation in closure arguments. There's an example, I think. And the other was the effect on the pattern meta variable. This is an example of using the notation in closure arguments. I think this consensus, well, my opinion, it looks pretty hard to read, but
Yeah.
Since closures use bars themselves. Yeah.
Exactly.
Also, yeah, doesn't seem like a really popular use case. You can still do it with parentheses.
Right. If you can do it with parentheses, does that also mean you can do it at a lower level of the pattern? Like if you know you're matching inside of a new type, can you match an OR pattern inside the parens of the new type, or do you need an additional set of parens?
I guess you can probably, yeah.
Then that seems like it would cover many of the cases, and the ambiguity of having an OR in between closure bars seems incredibly confusing. I personally would argue let's just not support that, and somebody can always add parentheses if they really want to.
Yeah. I mean, I have to check, but I would guess based on, it seems like.
Well, that one wouldn't, because some is refutable.
Yeah, well, you'd have to work extra hard to make this not parse, so I'm guessing it would.
Yeah.
The other question was whether to modify the macro meta variables.
Right. That one seems more up in the air.
Would it be something you do over an addition? I feel like I don't want to break people's code, but usually in the past when we do this, what we end up breaking is people who were using macros to simulate the syntax that we just added.
Right.
Which is annoying.
I have seen people use bar as a separator for other kinds of things that they're accepting for a macro. Like I want to take 12 things and they may contain commas, so I'll use bar as the separator. But those things were not generally patterns. They were some other kind of tokens.
I don't know. We tried to forward proof against this, but we found that in practice it's not very effective as we would like with the follow set analysis.
Interestingly, if you wrote a pattern in a macro that was trying to implement OR patterns in the most obvious way, and you parse things that are one or more patterns separated by bars, and we just change this so that pattern grabs the whole thing, then your macro will just trivially work. So the only case we would have to worry about is if you write it in a non-obvious way, or if you're using bar to mean something other than OR patterns.
Or if you have something else, another list the same length of like values associated with those patterns somehow.
Right, for example.
And the repeats are the same length.
So one option would be to encourage someone to do a creator run. I guess the other question is, would we be okay stabilizing without doing this and making this change at some later point?
I think it would be confusing if there's a type of pattern that you can't match in a macro as a pattern, and macros end up having to go implement OR syntax in order to match what patterns have now become. That actually seems like it would break more things if we want to introduce it in the future. So I think that if we're going to do that, we probably should do it sooner rather than later.
It's an interesting dance for things like the matches macro and everything.
Right. I think that we probably should introduce this, we should do a quick crater run if we can. And if this is low impact, I think we should go ahead and do it. The tricky bit will be what happens if it's high impact, but we can decide that if it happens.
Why don't we encourage someone to open a PR for a creator run and we discuss after we have data? Someone want to leave a comment?
Yeah, I can do that.
Let's keep going. So, mutable reservation conflict lint. We talked about this with Linting. There's not really any major updates here. I don't know if we should go into it because it's a complex topic, but we do need to resolve it at some point. The main thing is that the last time we talked about it, we thought maybe the creator impact was low, but actually it's a lot of regressions in raw number. But they're in like random GitHub repositories and crates, IO. So yeah. I'm going to move us on though, but I think we should return to this.
Is there any action to take there in the meantime you can think of, Nico?
I mean, not really. Like we could certainly just leave it as status quo, or we can. I don't know what action we can take that is not make a decision. Apart from try to. It seems like the answer is we won't be able to really assess the impact at the moment. As far as we know, there is no impact because even normal stack borrows kind of, or even normal two-phase borrows force stack borrows to be very conservative. So, or even the more limited form. So there's really no reason to keep denying this with the current formulation. However, maybe that will be an idea we can.
There's also one other interesting observation. It's not just that it's random GitHub repositories. A couple of people observed that it was in a lot of repositories of people trying to do solutions of exercises like, you know, learning Rust for the first time and doing, let me solve a fixed set of problems to try to do an exercise, which suggests that there may be some interesting pattern that people are inclined to follow that leads them to write this code. So there might be some value in reaching out to a few people or trying to figure out like what exercises they were doing if it isn't obvious, and seeing if there's some particular reason that this regularly happens so that we can understand why do people end up writing this Rust code, and if that's a concern, then we could try to address it. We might learn something about how people learn to write Rust code who are not us.
I'm willing to look into that. That sounds interesting. And it might actually be supported by my current job. Maybe.
You're going to
Awesome.
examine some of the repositories. See if there's a takeaway. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, yeah.
We discussed this built-in implementations of default before. The context was that closures and function definition types, the proposal is that they should implement default. There were some further comments. I still feel a certain measure of skepticism. I don't know if anyone has any new thoughts, or if we should just leave it for more discussion on the thread.
I think I would say that the discussion has boiled down to there's some set of folks, including me, that feel that the right thing is not default, but potentially a new trait, which sort of encompasses this set of types which have function impulse and don't need like the type itself is sufficient to call it essentially. And like the main disadvantage of doing that is obviously that it's like in some sense more complicated. But
Part of me also thinks that the user's main thrust in there is also served successfully by making these things muckable when we have safe transmute. So there might be a reasonable option for punting on defaults and exploring more of the things like another trait or something. If
Yeah, the
safe
primary
transmute
use.
work that's actually happening might do something useful for them here.
Yeah.
Yeah, something
Really,
feels very non-intuitive to me, and it suggests that like closures would implement default if their upvars are default, which we all know, I think agree is not a good idea.
Right. So it seems like the only case where we would even want to consider this is when the closure just doesn't capture anything and it was trivially convertible to a function.
that's what this proposal is.
Right. No, I was agreeing.
Yeah. So I kind
But
of,
even then, it's very confusing.
I also think it's confusing, but I would rather implement default than introduce a new trait that users have to learn in order to access the behavior. Like if we're gonna have the behavior, I think we should just have it in every way that we can have it. And we should not make users jump through a hoop to get access to it because it's a weird thing to do. So I think like if we decide to have the behavior, I would think we should have them implement default and also be transmutable from unit and just everything that like, if we decide that we're going to implement the behavior of like, if you know the type, you can call it, then we should do it through anything that users could think of is my attitude. Like users shouldn't be like in a situation where they're trying to do this and then they find out it doesn't work and then they're frustrated and confused and then they have to Google around forever to find the right way to do it because we decided that what they wanted to do was confusing, right? Like either they do it, they can or they can't.
So,
Yeah, I think that question of does knowing the type let you summon an instance and call it is a very interesting question that isn't obvious to me, at least.
Yeah. It's also
Especially for
not obvious
closures.
if, right. It also doesn't seem obvious if there is some further implication for forward compatibility. Like this, it's kind of an implementation detail that we happen to use a zero size type of a unique type for this. Is that something that we want to commit to going forward, that these closures will always have a zero-sized unique type as opposed to, oh, hey, it looks like it has the right type for a function. Maybe we just give it a function type to begin with. We wouldn't be allowed to make that change if we do this. If we don't do this, we potentially could make such a change compatibly.
No, I don't think that this, that's right. I don't think that's right. I think that either, if it's not, if it's already a breaking change.
but I'm trying to figure out how to capture what both said. But you were saying basically that that's not quite what I expected you to say. You were saying if we're going to do it, we should do it in all kinds of ways. If we're going to allow all closures.
Like I think it's a perfectly reasonable. Like I also think any code that needs this is really weird. I don't mind not supporting the behavior, but I definitely don't think we should introduce a new name that users have to learn in order to access this weird behavior that they want. Like I think they should just be able to do it the intuitive way.
That I definitely agree with. We shouldn't introduce some other trait that does this instead of default, and not introduce default. I think I would argue we shouldn't do either, but I agree with the statement that we shouldn't do the latter and not the former.
I guess I don't think.
Yeah, I'm good. Because it's a proposal on a thread is that there should be like a trait for functions that have no state, which then you could get a singleton value of them, right? But like,
right.
That to me seems like the worst of all worlds because we have the behavior, but it's really difficult to figure out how to get it.
One thing that does seem worth noting, as far as I can tell, it is possible to write this code today. It's just not possible to write it without unsafe. You can transmute unsafely from a unit and magically synthesize one of these values. You just can't do that safely. So if somebody wanted to write a safe wrapper for that, they could.
I don't
There's
know
no
if that's,
trait bound, I think. Go ahead, Bones.
Yeah, there's no way to say that the function doesn't have any state. right now, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah, I will say that I don't personally feel that default is, like, I feel default is less intuitive than having a fourth trait that is like, if you're, taking a function generically, well, there's 4 ways to do it. You can take a function that is sort of has no state and you can do anything you want with it. You can take it, by sort of shared reference, mutable reference, or you can take ownership. Like
Yeah.
that feels like a relatively explainable story versus, no, there's 3 traits, but if you, need to synthesize one magically, something that you probably have never actually, like, people writing a T default bound seems really rare. Like, I've never done it outside of like standard library methods. That is sort of weird.
Yeah, an FN static that lets you call it without having an instance is, I agree, seems kind of reasonable. I don't know if it's worth it, but it doesn't seem all that confusing to me.
So yeah, I think that's actually, I don't disagree. But I definitely think that if we do add it, then we should also add the implementation of default. Like, so that if someone has an FN static and they just call default on it, right? Or they try to pass in a bound that expects default, it should work properly. They shouldn't have to like create a new type to run that.
Yeah. I think Josh said something interesting earlier as well, that like, I kind of like this as we should expose a valid way to do this, but not necessarily a safe way. This isn't exactly what Josh said, but I'm jumping a bit because this is what it made me think. That the case in the thread has an instance at one point. So the safety invariant of you can't just randomly duplicate instances without knowing stuff about them would apply if we gave people a unsafe but valid way to do this somehow.
All right. Let's take these comments back to the thread and move on. Got enough here. I don't know.
One other question here. Is it possible that muckable would, or not muckable, safe transmute would solve this problem in a different way? Not that you would use safe transmute as the way of implementing this, but rather if you know that the way that you can write in the type system, this closure has no state, is I can turn this into a regular FN safely? That would be a type bound that says I have no state, right?
You can't transmute it to a lowercase fn because it doesn't have the same, because the lowercase fn is bigger.
Okay, never mind. We can take that to Zulip then.
Yeah. Okay, I want to call attention to this PR. So I think we can probably R+ this, but this is a PR by Ralph, basically adding an annotation to clarify that the way LVM works today, at least, a box unit pointing to previously allocated memory that has since been freed is undefined behavior. Drag, but here it is. I think it's kind of just a fact.
Is it true that the previously allocated memory here is like provenance wise? Like it's not like it's not based on the literal number, so you don't run into trouble if you like synthesize non-null aligned pointers or whatever, right? Because those are like you never actually allocate them.
I believe this is true, but I'm not sure. I was wondering. I have to read into it a little more deeply.
Because it seems like we would have sort of potential problems if we box ourselves in there in some sense, even if,
Yeah, I mean, we can always remove UB, but kind of depends on what LVM does. Like, if it is indeed real QB within LVM, then we have problems. It seems like we'd have to stop using the gap bounds in that case.
Yeah.
I'll try to pose that question.
Or declare it UB to allocate in the, like the bottom page or something, which is probably not great.
Yeah. So I guess let's ask this question. Does anyone object to me R+ing once we ascertain that indeed this reflects what LVM says?
If there's no way for us to work around it so that if there's no way for us to work around it, then yes. If we could work around it by not doing inbounds, then that's another question.
I think we could work around it by removing gep inbound, but it would be a performance hit, but like across the board.
Could we like remove inbounds only for ZST offsets or something? Well, no, we don't even emit ZST offsets, so I don't know what any of this means.
Probably this will get, yeah, I don't know. Let me look a little more into finding out what it means. And if I think it's controversial, I can come back. I don't want to talk about this too much, except to highlight that Dr. Shenkov wrote a PR to implement pub macro rules, which I guess is very easy. I haven't looked too closely at what its full semantics are that are actually implemented here. And I think personally that it probably merits an RFC or something. But maybe people want to look into it if they're interested. And I guess I would ask if people feel it needs an RFC. I think so.
I do think it needs at least a minimal spec for the specific reason of if we're going to do this, it should probably be with a transition where things aren't pub unless they're pub. Like this should be a transition where we say, well, this should be an alternative to exporting a macro. You should also potentially be able to pub create a macro. So we should have a coherent spec that says what's the preferred alternative.
Right.
But yeah, it seems reasonable. I'd love to see it happen.
I guess I think it seems like a major user visible feature to me. I feel it needs an RFC. It's not like a minor tweak.
Agreed.
Yeah, good point. It's asking everyone to redo how they do macro rules macros. So
Right.
Yeah, I agree, but I'm also enthusiastic about it. So
Yeah.
agreed.
We should also make sure that there's nothing that we want to key off of it. If there's some minor transition in terms of macro visibility or macro placement within crates or similar that we've been meaning to do, we could potentially key it off of, did you declare your macro using pub macro rules or macro export macro rules? And so we should do a quick thought of, is there anything we want to key off of that?
Okay. Maybe you can comment to that effect.
Will do.
Okay, so next thing, this is I think pretty minor, but it's a rename of the overlapping patterns lint to overlapping ranges, if I'm not mistaken, or overlapping range endpoints. Rejection for this. I guess I can execute it, but I wanted to bring it up in a meeting here.
Can this
All right.
break anything?
No, because we still accept the old name. Not breaking.
Cool.
Okay. Next one, promotion special case. Actually, I'm going to skip past this because I don't think there's much to say about it. There's a special case in promotion. This PR did a crater run to figure out if that special case was actually used by anything, and I think it came back as no. So the idea would be to remove this case. I have not looked too closely at what it is. I guess it has to do with unsafe cells. So we've been on a like general run of letting Ralph simplify promotion. Kind of assume we're going to continue doing that. But should I FCP it? I guess I will.
Sounds good.
All right. Unused dot comments lint to inner items. Last 5 minutes. This is an interesting one. So right now, this does not get any warning if you put a dot comment on an inner item, like inside of a function, even though those do not appear in RustDoc. I don't know whether you consider that surprising. I actually don't. Like the expected behavior to me, but we should decide. This PR makes it a unused dot comment lint.
Would this trigger on if you generate a macro, generate this code with a macro? Because that seems like the most common way you would end up with a dot comment on a inner item is if you have a macro generating the code that includes the item and a generated dot comment.
I don't know whether this, I assume so, unless it specifically screens them out. But to me,
If it
like,
would,
I write
if it
comments,
doesn't screen them out, I think this is a bad idea.
like I feel like I write comments on my code, whether or not it's part of a function, like whether, and I use dot comment not for RustDoc, but just to signal this is a comment attached to the item.
One thing that jumps to mind is where this might be good is if you put a compile fail doc test on one of these things that won't run, which might surprise you.
That's a good point.
Or just
That
any
is
of the doc
weird.
tests in general.
Yeah.
I would be entirely in favor of linting on a doc test written in a place where the doc test will not be run, whether or not it is macro generated.
I don't know. The other point is, I wonder if that's actually true. Like, could we just run the test? Yeah, we should find out if that's true.
Running the test might be, I don't know what context it expects to run in. I guess it expects to run at global level because they all run from a main, so that none of them have special access, right?
Yeah.
So yeah, maybe we could just run it.
Well, it's a good point that you probably couldn't like call the function in your test.
Right. I mean, you might be able to if it's actually a function, but if it were some other item, you wouldn't be able to reference the item.
Even the function, I don't think you could call it unless you like no mangled it and extern rusted it or something.
Yeah.
Sure.
Okay.
Or unless RustDoc did some sort of translation to find the mangled name.
Well,
Probably the only one you could actually run would be if you have an impl in there.
Doc comments
Well-
do see, like, it does seem to run the function doc test on nested functions. So in that sense, that's not really a concern here.
Oh,
It
cool.
is running it?
As far as I can tell, yeah.
Okay. Great.
then I think we should keep it personally.
Yeah, I agree that I definitely write doc comments on stuff inside. Like I almost want him on like expressions sometimes.
Yeah, I do sometimes too. They feel different. But I feel like anything you can do to an item at top level, you should be able to do to an item in this level.
So the supposed benefit here is about user confusion. People who might think that they're expecting docs to come out of these things. Is that the? I mean, do we have evidence of that?
Not that I know of. But
And I think even if so, like my argument would be that maybe RustDoc should like have some, way of showing things that are not public, like if you do document private items or something. But
Actually,
even
Right.
then,
yeah, that this
It'd
being a
be a
warning
great
from
way to do
RustDoc,
literate programming.
there is, I feel like there is sufficient value in doc comments, even if I never look, like for the compiler, I never look at RustDoc because it's just not like easy to do. Or maybe just my mind doesn't go there, but doc comments are still really useful.
Yep, that's pretty much what I feel. All right, so I think the consensus of this meeting is you don't want to make this change for the reasons above, right?
And actually, if you do the like pub thing in a non-exported method, it doesn't show up in RustDoc either, right?
Right. If it's a private method, I don't think it shows up unless you ask it to.
so I one more thing I want to ask here. So this lint, I'm assuming that if we were to approve it, it'd be something that applies to RustC as well as RustDoc, right? Or is it something that only applies to RustDoc when it runs?
It's a RustC lint, as far as I know.
Okay, so the reason why I asked that is because I would perhaps be inclined to having some sort of feedback from RustDoc itself, not necessarily a lint, but some way of it's saying, by the way, hey, I encountered like this, and this that like I didn't generate docs for, like in case you care, right? That's something that someone using RustDoc might find useful while not impeding the people who are using RustC.
I
Sorry,
tend to
Red Time,
agree.
I gotta drop.
Yeah, I think we also lack a mode of sort of warnings for people like using editors and stuff. Like that sort of warning is really annoying to silence.
All right. I'm gonna paste these comments into the PR, and I don't think there's anything we have to go to, so we'll get to the rest of these next time. Thanks, everybody.